All right, let's jump right in. Welcome, everyone, to today's Explainer. We are embarking on a really fascinating journey through Jeanette Winterson's absolutely brilliant analysis, One Aladdin Two Lamps. We're going to explore how something as simple as a childhood trip to the theater can completely unspool into this profound exploration of human survival, the heavy, heavy truths of societal determinism, and honestly, the sheer unadulterated power of storytelling. If you love discovering the hidden mechanics behind the narratives that literally shape our lives, well, you are in exactly the right place. Take a second to really think about the duality hinted at by the cover art for this piece. Two faces, one Aladdin, two lamps. Throughout this explainer, we're going to unpack the deep metaphorical power hiding inside these classic tales that we all kind of think we know. We're going way past the Disney movies and the pantomimes to see what these stories are actually doing right underneath the surface. To set the tone for all of this, we've got this incredibly provocative quote from Winterson's 1987 novel, The Passion. She writes, "I'm telling you stories, trust me." It's a paradox, right? Stories are, by definition, fictions, and yet here we are being asked to trust them as actual vehicles for truth. This really establishes Winterson's authority right out of the gate and hints at the mysterious, almost magical power of narrative that we are about to decode together. Section 1. A Pantomime Awakening. To understand the massive historical and societal forces at play here, Winterson argues we have to start with a surprisingly innocent, highly personal memory. She remembers the morning as being, quote, crisp as an apple. Just picture it. We are transported to this freezing day where a young Jeanette Winterson, who was a poor, adopted child wearing these borrowed, shiny patent shoes, is waiting in this massive line outside a theater. Her dad's factory had actually paid for the workers' children to see a pantomime. It's literally her first time in a theater. The curtain opens on Peking and she sees Aladdin. Now, the Victorian version of the story is a classic rags to riches, poor boy makes good narrative. And sitting there in that dark theater, smelling of toffee, she finds this early glimmer of escape from what felt like a very harsh, completely predetermined life. Section 2. The Survival of Scheherazade. Because, these stories absolutely did not start in a cozy British theater. We have to pivot from the pantomime to the true origin of these tales and dive deep into the high-stakes mythology of the East. Consider the grim reality of this ancient kingdom. 1001 Nights begins with an ending that's just intended to run on repeat. The Sultan, Shahryar, discovers his wife's infidelity, and to avenge himself, he makes this horrific decree. He's going to wed a fresh virgin every single night and murder her every morning. This is the brutal, ticking clock of chronological time. It's a world where women are treated as completely disposable possessions, and their life expectancy is quite literally measured by an hourglass. So, the crucial turning point here is how the Grand Vizier's daughter, Scheherazade, decides she's going to beat this horrific system. She actually volunteers as the bride. She gets into the Sultan's bed, and right before her scheduled execution in the morning, she starts to tell a story. But, and here's the genius part, she doesn't finish it. The Sultan is so desperate to know what happens next that he lets her live another day. She takes a simple narrative cliffhanger and wields it like a weapon to pause her own death sentence, day after day, night after night. And honestly, this timeline brilliantly illustrates the untidy exuberance of humanity. Because as Scheherazade spun her tales, the real-life collection of 1001 Nights was doing the exact same thing across geography and history. It took about 400 years for tales from India and Persia to merge with stories from Iraq, Egypt, and Syria. The stories escaped, they recombined, and they completely defied neatness. They adapted to wherever they landed, kind of like a virus, or, well, much like the human species itself. Now, to really grasp Shehrazade's true genius, we have to compare two very different concepts of reality. Her pressing problem sat in what we call chronological time. That's the literal arrow flight of the day ticking relentlessly toward her execution. But her solution? That existed entirely in inner time. This is where our minds live, right? It's where we daydream, where an entire year can pass in 2 seconds. She pulled the Sultan completely out of his deadly chronological clock, basically dismantled his ticking madness, and replaced it with the sanity and the total freedom of inner narrative time. Section 3. The Merchant and Fate. Let's see this in action. Let's look at how this builds within the actual text of the Arabian Nights by checking out the very first story Scheherazade tells the Sultan. The story begins in the most mundane way you could possibly imagine. A merchant sits down at an oasis to eat his lunch. He enjoys some aubergine, some bread, and a delicious date. When he finishes, he casually tosses the date stone away. But in the invisible, larger world that operates right alongside ours, that stone hits and kills an invisible being. Suddenly, this towering cloud of dust solidifies into a massive, wrathful Ifrit, a powerful winged spirit who glares down at the merchant, demanding a life for a life. Literally, an absolute accident has just sealed the merchant's doom in a split second. The merchant begs for a year to get his affairs in order, and surprisingly, the Ifrit grants it. But the merchant knows he has to return to forfeit his life, which leaves us hanging on this incredibly dramatic question: who can escape their fate? This is exactly the kind of hook Scheherazade used to trap the Sultan. But Winterson uses this question to pull us right out of the fairy tale and force us to look at our own, often harsh reality. Section 4. The Trap of Determinism. Because think about it, that towering Ifrit demanding a life for a life, that inescapable death sentence totally mirrors the very real-world traps of societal expectations and determinism that so many face today. Winterson asks us to think about how many lives are lost to being born into the wrong story. Look at these labels. I am poor. I am a woman. I am queer. I am non-white. I am uneducated. These facts seem to bind us fast. Before we even have the vocabulary to speak up for ourselves, our circumstances are already writing our script. The world shapes our developing minds based on labels we never, ever chose. We find ourselves caught between two massive forces. First, there is the nurture lottery. You obviously don't get to choose if you're born into a stable democracy or a war zone, right? Or to loving parents versus abusive ones. But then, on top of that, there is the nature trap, your DNA. Winterson shares this incredibly bleak quote from her own adoptive mother, who used it to excuse Winterson's perceived badness. What's bred in the bone comes out in the marrow. It is this totally suffocating idea that your biology is just an inescapable cage. And guys, this idea has an incredibly dark scientific history. Winterson dives into how Charles Darwin's perfectly legitimate biological science from On the Origin of Species was completely twisted. Darwin's own cousin Francis Galton coined the term eugenics, advocating for the actual elimination of so-called undesirables. Meanwhile, Herbert Spencer coined the tabloid soundbite we all know, survival of the fittest. Together, as Winterson points out, they turned complex, nuanced science into a crude social doctrine, one that was used to justify racism, sexism, the rigid class system, and ultimately ethnic cleansing. It was a narrative completely designed to keep the powerful in power and push the weak to the absolute bottom. To really see how deeply embedded this fatalistic, almost hopeless narrative was, just listen to the lyrics of this hymn from 1848, All Things Bright and Beautiful. The rich man in his castle, the poor man at his gate, God made them high or lowly and ordered their estate. Winterson recalls being a poor child in Sunday school, literally 120 years later, still being forced to sing this off by heart. It's a narrative quite literally designed to tell you, hey, stay in your place, your fate is sealed. Section 5. Rewriting your own story. This brings us to the climax of our analysis, because if we are trapped by these heavy historical and societal narratives, how do we push back? How do we survive the Ifrit of determinism? Well, Winterson shares this pretty incredible anecdote. 10 years after that very first pantomime, she was walking to the Accrington Public Library to return a copy of the Arabian Nights. It was a Carnegie library, built by the ultra-wealthy steel magnate. And written right there on the stained glass window, it said, "Industry and prudence conquer. Work hard, do well." Simple, right? But looking at that window, Winterson realized that as a poor, adopted female, working hard in a totally rigged system simply wasn't going to be enough to save her. She felt way more like Aladdin than Andrew Carnegie. Which leads to this completely heartbreaking realization: I am trapped in a story I didn't want to hear. I mean, wow. This just perfectly summarizes the suffocating weight of social and biological determinism. When the world has already written a script for you, one that ends in failure or mediocrity or silence, what do you actually do? Where's your flying carpet? You do exactly what Scheherazade did. You use the magic of narrative. You dispute the fixity of time and the rules of the game itself. I want to leave you with this final, empowering, and deeply provocative thought from Winterson. I can change the story because I am the story. When the Ifrit of society tells you your fate is sealed, you absolutely do not have to lie weeping on the divan. You can roll out your own story, you can stretch time, and you can rewrite your own ending. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer today. Keep questioning the stories you're told, and much more importantly, keep writing your own.